My name is Ben Rabin from Syracuse, New York, and I'm a lawyer.
Okay. If I ask a question, try to incorporate the question in the response. And some find that harder to do than others. I'm sure you would be great. Tell me how you got involved in all of this.
Well, I got involved with the motorcycle community as a motorcyclist first. I've been riding since I was about 8 years old. I delivered newspapers on a motorcycle. I rode in college. When I was in law school, the only means of transportation I had was a motorcycle. So I've been involved in the motorcycle culture most of my life. When I began practicing law, I realized that some of the laws in the state where I practice, New York, are very unfavorable to motorcyclists. And so I was having a difficult time representing my clients facing these unfair situations and unfair legal hurdles that they had compared to everybody else. And it got me involved in what's a bigger picture here, I think, which is the discrimination and the unfair treatment of motorcyclists.
And can you give some examples of how you've seen that?
Yeah, in terms of the laws, I've seen certain, for example, insurance coverages that are offered to everybody in New York who's operating a vehicle with the exception of motorcycles. And we've gone to Albany and we've asked them to change these things, and of course they've refused. And so if you're involved in an accident, for example, in New York, you automatically have less benefits, less insurance coverage than everybody else does. And unfortunately, for accident victims, for example, they don't know this. I mean, who in the world is going to find this out ahead of time? So they have these horrific economic repercussions because the laws are not fair.
And do you represent some or many or how many of the highwaymen?
Well, I represent generally injured motorcyclists for a career, and I got involved with the Highwaymen because of the Tyler and Peeps case. And what ended up happening is in my experience in civil litigation generally, they asked me to help defend them against a lawsuit that was brought by, strangely enough, the people that started the whole fight, at least in my opinion. And so through that involvement, I've gotten to know the gentleman here, and it's a very good group of guys, and it's my pleasure to do this work. And I don't know if you want to include this, but I have not charged them a penny for this because I believe very strongly in what's going on here and in their innocence.
Right, so you weren't their attorney who recommended other people. You were one of the recommended people. Is that the case? Or are you only coming in to handle the civil?
I'm here to help defend the lawsuit that was brought by the injured parties, and they don't have insurance that covers that, so I'm involved in the people who don't have automatic counsel assigned to them.
Okay. All right. You've seen the tape. You've talked to the people. How much can you say since you have a civil action pending? I'll let you say whatever you want to say.
Yeah, I've seen the tape. The criminal action is done already, so there's a lot of things that have been put on the record, some admissions and some facts that have already become clear based on what people have said in court. But this current lawsuit is the parties who were, again, in my opinion, the parties that were responsible for instigating this fight have brought against the Highwaymen, both known and unknown. It's an amazing lawsuit, and I give you access to the papers that have been filed in court, but you'll see that they've named a tremendous number of people, of course, most of them John Does. But they've brought this lawsuit alleging that they've sustained these horrific injuries as a result of something that the Highwaymen did wrong. And of course, we have two defenses to this. One, Highwaymen didn't do anything wrong. They went to a bar as public facility to use it, to enjoy it as everybody else in that establishment did. And as you can see from the tape, things didn't turn out the way they had hoped. But the second defense is that these alleged injuries that are being brought as part of the lawsuit are not as severe or in fact exist at all, at least as they're claimed to have been in the papers.
Yeah, if Tyler and Peeps are guilty of anything, it's having bladders that required relief. If they hadn't been hanging out over next to the bathroom waiting to go in, maybe this would have never happened.
And again, I don't know because we haven't seen any of the medical records. We only have the allegations of these alleged injured people. But if the only thing they're guilty of in terms of getting this fight started is having to use the bathroom, and somebody really did get hurt, then the only other thing they might be guilty about is the ability to defend themselves. Perhaps if they just stood there and taken a beating, none of this would happen, but yet they'd be in the hospital still.
Again, if I ask you a question that's improper or you can't answer, just say. The allegation or the position that the judge or the prosecutor took in the criminal case was that what happened inside the bar is completely separate from what happened outside the bar. Now, I've always thought of things as cause and effect and a continual string of events. I don't see how under any logical, decent person's view you can say that those are two separate incidents. They haul the guy out of the bar. Is there any kind of legal basis that you can think of to treat these as two separate things? Is there case law that says if you start a fight in the bar and then go outside, it's two separate events?
The underlying criminal action, one of the things that the district attorney and the judge were relying on is the fact that this was two separate incidents. So even if the patrons of the bar, not Tyler and Peeps, but the patrons of the bar and the owners of the bar started this incident, I think the allegation is that once it got outside, it's a whole new fight. And again, I haven't reviewed the actual rulings and I have not looked at the case law for that particular issue, but if you think about it in terms of common sense, that's like saying a boxing match is completely separate when it's between the first and the second round. And that's even an absurd analogy because in the boxing match there's a bell and somebody comes up and holds a card and the fighters separate themselves intentionally. And you would never call the first round and the second round somehow a different fight. It's the same thing. Here it's just a melee that's spilled out into the street. I think it's absurd to think of it as being two separate incidents. And again, that's what the prosecutor's job is to do, is to create the facts in their best scenario to help get a conviction. And I think here, unfortunately, and I don't have privy to what the judge's ruling was, but unfortunately there was a threat that the judge was going to rule in the prosecutor's favor, and perhaps if that had happened, the appellate court would have ruled that way also. And it's a risk that you have to be prepared to take, and I think in the case of Tyler and Peeps, they were faced with a really difficult decision. Do we worry that this ruling's going to go against us, in which case we've got a long jail sentence ahead of us, or do we take this deal and avoid the uncertainty of going to jail for a very long time?
You said the prosecutor's job is to get a conviction. Should a prosecutor's job be to be ethical and have some sense of doing what's right? Aren't they government employees? Don't the highwaymen pay their salary?
You're absolutely right. The prosecutor's job, I should have been more clear, is of course not just to get a conviction. I'm going under the assumption that the prosecutor has a 100% belief that the conviction he's seeking is a legitimate one. He is convinced beyond all doubt that this person he's accused of a crime has actually done this crime and deserves the punishment that the crime, if convicted, will give that person. So if the prosecutor is looking to have a conviction for reasons other than his true belief or her true belief that there's guilt involved, then that's when we have corruption. And that's one of the things that, whether it's in this case or other cases, we know happen all the time. Prosecutors have their sights set on somebody and they're going to do whatever they can to make sure they get a conviction. And it's horrible and it does happen, and I don't want to besmudge what I believe is a very good collection of prosecutors in this country, but we can tell from history that people are wrongfully convicted based on prosecutorial misconduct more than a few times a year.
A person who I have a lot of respect for says 25% of the people in prison are probably innocent.
I spent some time in legal aid, and you certainly don't have to use this as part of our testimony, but one of the things as a public defender that I had to deal with was getting people who were pretty clearly guilty of something off the hook. And emotionally, in terms of what that meant to society, was made a little bit easier for me by the fact they were getting arrested again in 3 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks anyway. And after I left legal aid for 4 or 5 years, I would see the same people come up in the police blotter. They're going away. Most of the people who get arrested truly have a reason to be involved in the justice system. But in my opinion, convicting somebody who has done nothing is far worse than letting a few guilty people go. And the horrific, in my opinion, torture that people who are innocent have to go through when they're in prison is worth taking every conceivable effort we can to make sure somebody innocent doesn't go to jail. It's absolutely devastating, and you hear about it all the time, people who are wrongly convicted. We had it with African Americans for decades, and now we've got it with motorcyclists. And I see it all the time in my legal practice. People who would normally be let go by the police or law enforcement are stopped, detained, and questioned solely because of the mode of their transportation. They're on 2 wheels in a motorcycle, and because of that, they are targeted by the police.
is there any hope of getting bikers a fairer shake in the system, or do you think this is just something that they're going to have to live with?
I think eventually motorcyclists will be given the respect that they deserve and will be given fair treatment. And it's going to come about the same way it's come about with everybody else who's been discriminated against over history, which is acceptance and education. And in the meantime, the way we deal with it is by laws. And for example, Washington State had a problem with police unfairly treating motorcyclists, and so they passed a law that said it's illegal to discriminate against motorcyclists. Other states around this country have followed, and we have introduced one here in New York that models after that same Washington State law, and we're hoping that that's going to get passed also. And while that may not change the treatment that the law enforcement people are motivated to give the motorcyclist, at least it will make their actions illegal. And now, if you're pulled over for no reason whatsoever, other than the fact that you're driving a motorcycle, you've got some recourse. You can say, look, that's an illegal stop. Because currently, there's nothing wrong, legally, with these motorcycle-only checkpoints where they're just randomly driving around and pulling over everybody in a motorcycle. So I think that's going to be the first. And the second thing, and this is close to my heart, is the charity work that's done by motorcyclists. My son was born premature, my first son, and his life was saved by the March of Dimes. The Bikers for Babies charity ride is a motorcycle event that raises hundreds of thousands of dollars to give to the March of Dimes to save children like my son. And you know what? I see every year, because I'm in charge of this ride now, I see hundreds of motorcyclists giving up their Saturday and their hard-earned money to drive around the countryside, to drive around, donate their time and money to make sure that that babies have a fighting chance. I don't see accountants doing that. I don't see very many other organizations, other cultures give as much as motorcyclists do. And I think if that got out to the public a little bit more, I think that the public will be a little bit more accepting, and then these atrocities that are happening by law enforcement and other mistreatment that we're receiving would be looked on less favorably by a bigger part of the population.
Okay, any last thoughts?
That's it?
Well, you can keep talking for as long as you want.
It's whatever you need. If you got any other topics you want me to go on, I'm happy to.
Well, I was going to ask you about if you look at the Constitution and Bill of Rights, shouldn't the motorcyclists already have been protected?
Yeah, a lot of people have talked about the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and legal protections. And right now, motorcyclists are not the members of any protected class. There is nothing illegal, based on our Constitution, about pulling over a motorcycle unless the state in which this happens has already passed a law. Like I mentioned earlier, Washington State. But otherwise, there's nothing illegal, there's nothing inappropriate, at least legally, about discriminating against motorcyclists by law enforcement, and I think it's something we need to change. It's outrageous. If you substituted another group in there, it would bring outrage. You can just randomly start pulling over any black person you want and driving through a nice neighborhood. Oh, we did that. It was called racial profiling. It outraged everybody and it was eliminated. We do the same thing with motorcyclists. I drive a motorcycle to work. I pay my taxes. I have 4 children. I do a lot of charity work. I should not have to worry that on the way to work I'm going to get pulled over by the police simply because I'm driving a motorcycle.
Did you always want to be a lawyer?
My family has a little bit of a legal history. I've got great-grandparents, grandparents, and a father that were all lawyers, but nobody ever suggested that I do it. I was in college, didn't want to get a job. Med school seemed too hard, so I thought I'd go to law school, and I'm very happy I made that choice. I love my work. And because I focus on motorcyclists, I get to deal with the people that I like anyway on a daily basis. So when I get a call from one of my clients, we spend half the time talking about the case, the other half talking about riding.
If Tyler and Peeps when they get out of prison or jail, whatever, it's all prison.
Yeah.
It's a prison.
It's prison.
Attica,
it's prison. Yeah.
And they come to you and say, we want to sue the judge. Could you risk doing that?
I certainly would make a risk of going in any direction that my clients wanted. I put my clients before anybody else, no matter what it's going to do to my reputation or what it's going to do to my future career. My clients come first. But in terms of suing a judge, it's not a legal possibility. The judges make rulings, and the way you overcome that is by appealing that ruling to a higher court, but there's no direct cause of action against a judge. It's unfortunate, in a way, but on the other hand, our system would collapse if the judges had to worry about making rulings. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that a majority of the judicial decisions are correct, and the judges need to be able to make the correct decision, even if it's an unpopular one, without fear of being sued. Otherwise, our system collapses. So we have a lot of checks and balances in place, which is the ability to go to a higher court and have other judges review the lower court's decision. But in terms of a direct lawsuit against a judge, our system wouldn't work if we had the ability to do that.
Judges are officers of the court. If they commit fraud on the court, you should be able to bring in action against a judge for fraud on the court. RICO is a criminal act. Civil RICO requires that you prove predicate acts that are all criminal. There are no precedents to say that a judge you can't bring an action against a judge for either of those claims. However, what happens is the judges just dismiss it, and it never gets to where they ever have to issue a ruling. They just dismiss you, claim it's frivolous or whatever else. But unfortunately, I have a different perspective than you. Having traveled around and met people all over the country, I'm convinced that every federal judge in America is at least dishonest, if not corrupt. You know, I don't want to bore you with details of what happened.
I'm here, yeah.
But I'll do a 30-second version. Sued by the people who do boat rides at Niagara Falls. Never did business with the people who do boat rides at Niagara Falls. Never did business with any of their customers. They completely made up 50 sworn paragraphs in a verified complaint, swore I did all this stuff. Took their depositions after they stalled it for about a year and a half, and they'd managed to run up a fortune on our legal fees. They admitted, I asked our lawyer, I said, what will they do? He says, well, they got to just keep lying. So we go into the deposition, they admit they completely made it up, and it was all false. So in federal court, it's impossible to get a hearing. But the judge, on some minor issue, had a little meeting in chambers. So I asked to go with the attorney, and I took a banker's box with all the depositions, highlighted, took the complaint, footnoted every place that they admitted they were all false, told the judge that I had over 450 counts of perjury, and they admitted everything was false. She said, we're not here to discuss that. She ordered a summary judgment against me and ordered me to pay $450,000 in their legal fees, even though she didn't find me guilty of any offense. I appealed, had a million reasons. They just rubber stamped her. Took it to the Supreme Court. They didn't look at it. So I filed 3 petitions for writ of mandamus in the Supreme Court myself, and asked them one question. You know, you give them up to 3 questions.
Yeah.
Will you tell Judge Arundhati Evans that she has to abide by the Constitution? Will you touch Judge William S. Duffy? Will you tell the 11th Circuit judge? And they responded, we refuse, and we refuse. So I've appealed everything. I was advised to appeal early and often. Appealed it all. Got tons of proof of perjury, obstruction of justice by the judges. I've got docket sheets that show documents that I filed, and then a week or 2 later, the docket has magically disappeared. Things that have been filed that they never have docketed, that I've got signed proof that they were filed, because in federal court, receipt by the clerk is filing, whether they stamp it or anything else. To end my saga, I finally got before a county grand jury to bring charges against 6 federal judges and the district attorney in Fulton County, Georgia. I tried for 2 years, sat out in the lobby and handed envelopes to everybody that passed through, hoping I would get a grand jury. Finally, something got in the grand jury's hands. They voted to have me come in and present it. I went in, was totally prepared, gave a 30-minute presentation. They wanted me to come back at their next session, which was Tuesday, and bring no more than a 20-page document concisely listing the charges and footnoting the evidence, and then bring a box of evidence numbered that matched up. So I return on Tuesday, get off the elevator on the 3rd floor of the Fulton County Courthouse, which is lobby. I'm met by 3 Fulton County Sheriff's deputies and the chief investigator for the DA. They forcibly removed me from the courthouse, gave me a criminal trespass warning saying that if I ever return, I'll be arrested. Now that's a minimum of 10 years under Georgia law for interfering with somebody in the middle of their grand jury testimony. I was in the middle of my testimony. Filed criminal action, it was dismissed without the judge even showing up for the hearing. Filed a civil action, and the judge entered an order. I can never file another lawsuit anywhere in America for the rest of my life. I tried to go to the federal grand jury. They won't let me in the courthouse anymore. My picture's posted at every entrance. 8 by 10 color photo. So unfortunately, I've seen the bad side.
I have too. By the way, just so you know, I got sued and lost a case that was absurd. And without boring in the details with you, I lost a $1 million arson case for something that clearly I didn't do, and we found out later on what had happened. And so I have been on the bad side of the system when it's gone wrong. I've had clients that have had very bad outcomes after we did a great job for them based solely on a judge's ruling, which was absolutely, I mean, I'm not a dumb guy. I know what the rulings are. It's clear what the ruling should have been. Based on a judge's ruling, we took it up to a higher court. They affirmed that judge's ruling. And the irony is, 4 years later, I was at a seminar taught by that judge when he went exactly opposite from the ruling he gave my client and said, if you ever do this, this is how I'm going to rule. And I, of course, couldn't put my hand up there and say, hey, listen, don't you remember 4 years ago you did the exact opposite to me? So I agree with you that the system has flaws, that there are people who make the wrong decisions either intentionally or accidentally. I have no reason to believe this judge did it on purpose. I think he just made a mistake. But I still think the system as a whole is better than what it could be if we didn't have, what the country would be if we didn't have that system at all. I mean, the system does sometimes work.
Well, we're presenting to each, have already presented to the New York legislators 48 proposals. I'll send you a copy.
Yeah.
Let me get your card and I'll send it to you and you can see what it is we've proposed. Simple things like the first, I start with the easiest ones and then have the hardest ones, like make the model rules of professional conduct law that lawyers have to live by. I've read the New York rules of professional conduct. They're some of the most lax.
Well, New York got thrown out. New York has now adopted the federal ones.
Oh, really?
Just 2 years ago they changed and they've adopted the federal.
Well, I looked at them a couple years ago, must have been 2-3 years ago, and I said, there's hardly anything these guys have to do. So the model are good. I'd love for that to be law. But the easiest ones, first one is every proceeding has to be recorded. And each party has the right to do their own recording. Because I've got falsified transcripts, you name it. And other people do too. And in this modern day and time, now who could oppose that? The only excuse people come up with for not supporting it is, oh, if there were minor children or something involved. Well, wait a minute. The recording is for the court.
Yeah.
And for anybody who needs to see what exactly happened. And if there's parties involved, then they should have the right to record. They have the right to have transcripts. So that should be an easy one. And I hope we so far have 2 states for sure where people are charging forward, New Hampshire and Kentucky.
Well, similarly for wrongful convictions. I mean, we talked earlier today off the camera about people, young people, 15, 16-year-old boys that are held without their parents, without a lawyer for 30 hours with no food, just some water and no sleep, and get convicted. And yet this incredible ordeal they go through is not recorded other than the parts where they admit that they've done something wrong, which of course has been manipulated over the course of days and days by fresh police officers who continually rotate and come in. So I agree that there's all kinds of safety systems we can have in this country now that weren't available 20 years ago. You can record endless amounts of information and store it on something the size of my finger now, so we should. I agree. Everything that happens in a courtroom should be recorded.
Well, I won't bore you with the other proposals, but there's a lot of them that make a lot of sense, like give us jury trials. You know, if we pay for a jury trial, don't let the judge issue a summary judgment. Let's go to a jury.
Yeah.
If it's just a slam dunk thing where it's only the law, but...
Well, that's the theory, is a summary judgment, and the law in New York is very clear, because I've been on both sides of summary judgments now for 20 years. The judge should never do it unless there is nothing for a jury to decide. So in other words, if I accuse you of driving 55, and every bit of evidence points to the fact that you've never operated a car in your life, and there's zero evidence that you have operated a car, then there's no sense of that to go to the jury. The judge should say, look, nobody has ever said that the guy's driven a car, so we can't convict him of driving 55. So that's a case where summary judgment is appropriate. But if there's any factual issue whatsoever, of course it should go to a jury, and it should have happened in your case.
Sure it should have. Let me tell you that I researched every federal judge who's currently active in Georgia. There's 20 of them. Some of them have made it up to the appellate court, but were district court judges at one time. The oldest one has been there when I did it a year or so ago, 32 years. Every case involving a pro se plaintiff that was a contested case, because there was one where the other side didn't answer and the judge ruled for the guy. In 32 years, no pro se plaintiff in federal court in Georgia has ever won. No pro se plaintiff has ever gotten a jury trial. 75% of them get thrown out at the motions to dismiss. And it's not because the people are incompetent. I was every bit as good as, I was better than the lawyers I came up against. I knew the law. I did one appeal where the only thing I did, I had the benefit of knowing who the judges were handling it because they put in a screening mechanism for all of my appeals. So I automatically knew who the judges were.
Yeah.
So in my appeal, the only case law that I cited was all of their decisions that supported my position. And they ended up responding that the appeal was frivolous.
Yeah.
And
Well,
threw it out.
it happens both ways. And I can tell you, I used to work for Cigna Insurance Company, and one of the organizations I defended was regularly sued by prisoners operating pro se, and these cases were absurd. And there were a lot of times when the judge would say on the record, I really think this is appropriate for summary judgment, but because the person's pro se, I'm going to let this proceed. And I've seen it happen. And I'll leave you with this. My grandfather was a judge on the New York State Court of Appeals, the highest court in New York, second only to federal court. And he was one of the most caring, fair people I've ever met in my life. He was a champion of rent control and of human rights. And one of these amazing people that was in a position where he was essentially one of the most powerful judicial figures in the country, because that's the highest court in one of the most powerful states in the country. And never once did I ever see him use his power to anything other than the convenience of maybe getting a better parking spot when he had to go to work some days. So, you know, there are two sides to everything. I just think that it's unfortunate that when things go well, it's the way it's supposed to be. Nobody says a word about it. When things go bad, somebody's life gets ruined. So any mistakes, any misconduct, any accidental or intentional bad rulings by a judge or a jury have these generally horrible consequences. And that's why it's so important that we make sure guilty people don't go to jail and that the discrimination against motorcyclists is ended. Because like Tyler and Peeps, these guys are going to have their lives significantly altered because of some discrimination and some bias, and it can't happen. Not in this country, not in this day and age.
That's a wrap.